I did a video a few months back covering some ridiculous bumps and spots. You guys liked it, so my initial thought naturally was to do some more. However, things kinda took a turn. Quite a few people in the comments wanted me to look at primetime Elix Skipper's absolutely outrageous walk on top of the cage from TNA's Turning Point 2004 pay-per-view, and as I wrote about it, well, I ended up writing more and more. This is more than just a spot that's ridiculous enough for an entry in the list, it's an iconic moment that's worthy of a video all on its own. Hell, it's one of the greatest moves in wrestling history, something that truly hadn't been seen before and will undoubtedly never be seen again. So while I could include it as part of a list, it would make everything else just seem rather pedestrian by comparison. When you think of TNA, particularly in its first few years, you think of the cage walk. When you think of Elix Skipper and the various cool things that he did in the ring, the cage walk is the first thing that springs to mind. Even now, people watch this move for either the first time or the 100th time, and their mouths are still utterly agape, wondering how the hell he pulled it off. It's a spot that will never ever get old, and it deserves a proper run back to see how on earth it came about. So let's go back to the early years of TNA, to the Impact Zone, the "This is awesome" chants, the Don West and Mike Tenay on commentary and all of that, to a legendary moment that can be described with two words: no way. Before I start covering one of the best things to happen in a TNA ring, allow me a little digression into the world of gymnastics. Now, rather than the thing that an odd set of terminally online people believe wrestling has turned into, here I'm talking about actual gymnastics. At the 1972 Munich Olympics, the Belarusian gymnast Olga Korbut became a star for her incredible daredevil routines, winning 3 gold medals. Nowadays though, the one that everyone remembers is her uneven bars, which she actually didn't win a gold for but did get 9.8. Videos of it still go massively viral whenever it's presented. In particular, there's that one moment where Korbut stands on the top bar and performs a backflip, grabbing it again on the way down, a move that hadn't been seen before. This move is technically named the Korbut flip, although if you see modern videos of it, it's usually called the dead loop. We'll cycle back to all of this later, but I think there's a lot of comparisons to be made between this great sporting moment and the Elix Skipper cage walk. The broad comparison is that, as amazing as both of these things are, they aren't something you're ever going to see repeated. But the reasons for that aren't necessarily obvious. Anyway, the date is December 5th, 2004, and TNA's Turning Point is the company's second 3-hour pay-per-view after Victory Road. It's the end of the weekly pay-per-view era, and the arrival of proper monthly shows. It's a decent card on the whole. Other highlights include a fine X Division affair between Petey Williams and Chris Sabin, and a better than you expected brawl between Raven and Diamond Dallas Page. The show itself was mainly promoted by the appearance of Randy Savage, teaming with AJ Styles and Jeff Hardy against Jeff Jarrett, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall in what would end up being the Macho Man's final match. However, clearly this particular match likely wasn't going to be of the highest quality considering the age and conditioning of some of the folks involved. And indeed it wasn't. After all, Randy Savage sadly couldn't do a lot by this point, therefore he had to be booked so that he only appeared right at the very end, and there certainly wasn't going to be any big elbows dropping. With this in mind, clearly the show needs a bit more of a satisfying and action-packed main event. And so TNA and head booker Dusty Rhodes opt to close the show with something that's going to be a hell of a lot more intense, and is indeed the culmination of a very intense rivalry that's been going on for a little over a year and a half. The feud between Triple X and America's Most Wanted is absolutely one of the defining ones from the Asylum era. The company was kind of a mixed bag in many ways at this point, but these were guys you could always count on to deliver. On the face side, AMW consists of Cowboy James Storm and Wildcat Chris Harris, both of whom had been hired by TNA during their pre-debut tryouts, were very quickly put together, and quickly found success in the tag division. On the heel side, we've got Triple X, Fallen Angel Christopher Daniels, and Primetime Elix Skipper. They'd had a more complex history. They started out as a stable with Low Key also involved before he left the company, had a few breakups and makeups and so on, but if there was one consistent, It was battling with America's Most Wanted. Both X and AMW had won the tag titles multiple times, and over the year and a half that they'd feuded, they'd had all different kinds of bouts, an earlier steel cage clash, a last man standing. Hell, they were even forced to mix together at one point, with Daniels and Storm beating Skipper and Harris for the straps. Still, the battle rages on until we get to the end of 2004, and in this final bout in the 6 Sides of Steel, there's more than just championships on the line. Dusty Rhodes has stipulated that the losing team in this match has to disband forever. It all finishes tonight, so fireworks should probably be expected. The match itself is absolutely fantastic. As you would hope, it's the best one that the two teams ever had, and it's an utterly worthy main event where you're getting nothing but the best from the teams of Chris Daniels and Elix Skipper and James Storm and Chris Harris. The action is relentless and hate-filled from the get-go, and it takes about 2 minutes for colour to make an appearance, as the fallen angel gets slammed into the steel. In the end, 3 of the 4 wrestlers here are going to end up wearing the old crimson mask. Amidst the violence, we have important story beats and callbacks. Handcuffs have been an important theme in the feud, with X often cuffing a member of AMW to the ropes so that they can beat on the other, and AMW initially look to get their own back. However, it's X who get to use them first on Chris Harris, allowing them to wreck James Storm for several painful minutes, until finally Storm is able to make a crucial reversal on an attempted shot with the handcuff key and get Harris back in the match. It's here where things start to ratchet up even further. Regular old finishers like the Angel's Wins and the Catatonic simply aren't enough to get the job done, and the wrestlers start to climb that cage, not caring about any damage they do to themselves as long as it hurts the other guy more. Skipper makes an attempt to climb, but is intercepted by Storm and ultimately hit with a super bomb. Somehow this doesn't end it. Then you've got Daniels and Harris getting up to the top of the cage, trying to get the advantage over the other until, despite that brutal superbomb, Elix Skipper starts climbing up. And then not only is he at the top of the cage, he's trying to frickin' stand on it. After a struggle to get his footing, the fans chanting "Please don't die" at him, he frickin' manages to stand on the cage just as Harris is sat atop it and... well, you probably know the rest.
No! No way! No! No way! You got to be kidding!
My goodness. Elix Skipper walks the tightrope, gets to Harris, and ranas him from the top. Everyone goes absolutely apeshit. The late great Don West provides one of the most iconic calls in wrestling history as he and Mike Tenay completely lose their mind. It's almost unacknowledged that Daniels follows it up with a huge elbow drop from the cage. It's barely even noticed because everyone is still absolutely delirious thanks to what Elix Skipper has just done. He's done something that legitimately has never been done before in a wrestling ring. No one would even think of it, and even if they did, surely they wouldn't have dared to try it. The replay from the awesome camera angle that takes it just amplifies it. You can see how close he was at a point to losing his balance, and God knows what would have happened if he did. The camera angle's perfect, the call is perfect, the move is transcendental. In the end though, it's not enough to win X the match, which still goes on. We still have a massive Tower of Doom spot to get through, and you wonder just how much more these teams can take. However, it is Daniels who gets outsmarted, reversed, and finally cuffed to the ropes, hoisted up by his own petard. With Skipper utterly isolated, he has no prayer, eating a massive super kick before eventually AMW finish him off, not with the death sentence, but with X's own finisher, the Powerplex. After 20 hellacious minutes, AMW have finished the feud and come out victorious, while X have to break up forever. This whole match is a glorious skirmish, of course, one of the best bouts from TNA's early years, a brilliant feud ender, and one that you should absolutely watch in full, but there is obviously one moment that everyone was talking about after the match, and they're still talking about it today. For all the other great stuff that happens in the bout, nothing even remotely comes close to Elix Skipper's cage walk. So what's the whole story behind this spot? How was it even thought up? Well, if you've ever seen other Elix Skipper matches, you probably know that the tightrope is one of his signature spots. He quatches a guy on the middle of the top rope, then rope walks to him from the corner and ranas him. So yeah, it's not like the move came out of nothing. It's something Primetime performed pretty regularly, initially wowing the crowds with it when he was in WCW back in 1999 and 2000. Now that's not to say it isn't already a pretty high-wire spot, and indeed there were a few times where Skipper had attempted the move and he'd had to back out of it, or he'd slipped off. And of course there's quite the difference between doing it on the top rope and doing it on top of a frickin' cage, especially after nearly 20 minutes of thoroughly intense wrestling. When you're that high up, you don't exactly have the option of cancelling and dropping back into the ring. There is no redo. There is only glory or oblivion. In his show write-up in The Observer, Big Dave Meltzer said that while it was undoubtedly going to be the most memorable spot of the year, he prayed it would never be done again, and also mentions that the spot had been talked about beforehand, and that it was penciled in. If for any reason Elix Skipper didn't feel up to doing the spot at that climactic stage of the match, then it wouldn't have happened. However, from interviews that have taken place in the years since, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot that would have stopped Primetime from performing the spot once it had been agreed to. We've got a few accounts from the folks involved that corroborate those details. In an interview with Chris Van Vliet, Chris Harris said that he had to be convinced a fair bit by Primetime to take the spot. He initially thought his idea was absurd, and was concerned not just about taking the bump, but by how dangerous it was for Skipper. He pretty much rejected it until a few hours before the match when he was convinced by Primetime's confidence, and there was no practice involved. The cage wasn't put together in time for that. In a 2006 interview, Christopher Daniels said that while the spot was going on, he simply had one thought in his mind, that being, "Don't fall," while James Storm said that he was quite literally praying. One other point that comes up with Daniels is about the huge pressure to deliver with being in the main event slot, and you do wonder if the two teams also maybe had something to prove, going by the Observer report. Their last big match at Victory Road hadn't quite worked out, so they certainly needed to show that they could get the job done in such a slot. One other little note comes from AJ Styles, who, in another interview with Chris Van Vliet, said that not only was the spot unbelievable and that he'd seen nothing like it before or since, actually revealed that there weren't any real plans for Elix Skipper in TNA after the breakup of Triple X. He wasn't booked for the next load of Impact and Explosion tapings or indeed anything else. But AJ asked Jeff Jarrett if they were really going to send him home after that spot, and indeed they didn't. Plans changed, Skipper would stick around, and he'd ultimately get into a feud with partner-turned-rival Christopher Daniels, which, poetically enough, ended with an X Division title match at the debut of TNA's all-cage pay-per-view, Lockdown. While Primetime ultimately comes up short there, he actually does tease a repeat of the cage walk, which is more than enough for everyone to lose their minds again. And while Daniels wisely backs out of it, Skipper still performs a whopper of a dive off the top of the cage onto him and the ref. And as for the man himself, well, Elix Skipper discussed it in 2021 with Kiwi on his Get Funked podcast. He had the spot in his mind for a long time, and he would have actually done it when Triple X and AMW had their first cage match, indeed the company's first cage match, in June of 2003. However, the air conditioning had gone out in the asylum, everything was just too sweaty, and the spot would have been impossible. He said that he didn't quite know what he was thinking because when he got up there, he kind of realised just how much this 20-foot cage was going to be shaking when he walked on it, and after that, well, he didn't have any time to get scared. He just had to do it. As far as others' reactions over the years, there's been the odd mixed response, and one that I want to focus on, one of the most vocal, comes from Raven. Although unlike Meltzer, his criticism wasn't based so much on safety. Raven's quote was that it was the greatest move in the history of pro wrestling and no one cared, expanding on that by saying that the move really should have finished the match. It is hard to disagree with him there, honestly. It boggles the mind to think that in the structure of this match, the cage walk was almost like a transitory move, a closure of one sequence but one that's clearly going to be followed by another. Hell, you can clearly see that there is no point at all in Daniels performing that big elbow drop. The pin attempt from that isn't even seen due to the replays of the cage walk, and even the big Tower of Doom spot doesn't have as much impact as it should because, well, how can it possibly top what Elix Skipper's just done? And that's not to downplay those spots. Daniels' elbow drop off the cage is an absolute beaut. The Tower of Doom is a whopper of a high risk spot, one where if Daniels gets the slightest bit more rotation than he did, it's bad news for him, and it comes off perfect. They're great, but they just don't have quite the impact they should because, well, they had to follow the cage walk. If there is criticism to be made of the match as a whole, then that one is certainly valid. At the very least, there probably shouldn't have been any more big spots after the cage walk. And of course, this does bring up all those old questions when it comes to pushing the extremes in pro wrestling. Was it worth it? You always wonder if these moves were worth it when you consider the risks involved. Obviously you don't want to think about what would have happened to Elix Skipper if he had fallen, and I've no wish to spell it out. However, clearly it was to Elix Skipper, who'd been itching to do that move for a year and a half, and there wasn't much that was going to stop him. Even if Chris Harris had continued to refuse it, I absolutely believe that Primetime would have gone full Don Logan, haranguing the Wildcat mercilessly until he finally said yes. In the end, I suppose that, however it ended up playing out, we would still be talking about it today. Happily, we talk about it in a positive sense, as a truly incredible moment that is never going to be forgotten. Also, it's a moment that will never be replicated. However, perhaps not for the most obvious reasons. And it's here where we cycle back to Olga Korbut. When that flip goes viral today, it gets the name of Deadaloop, which it never had at the time, and it's said that the move was banned immediately after Korbut did it because it was too dangerous. Now, shockingly enough, considering that this info comes from Instagram reels and the like, this isn't true. There were several other Korbut flips done on the uneven bars. Hell, another Soviet gymnast, Elena Makina, added a freaking full twist to the move in 1978. The move itself wasn't actually banned. Rather, the act of standing on the high bar during a routine was banned in uneven bars in 1989, and it wasn't necessarily because of safety, it was because standing on the high bar disrupted the flow or constant movement of a routine, and eventually the distance between the bars was increased to a point where performing a Korbut flip would have been worthless anyway. And really it's a similar deal with Elix Skipper's cage walk. It's not as if such moves were immediately banned everywhere just because of safety reasons. It's pro wrestling after all, and I'm sure that were plenty of guys who would love to try and recreate the move. But a steel cage is a totally different beast now to what it was back in 2004. It's sturdier, and there's usually a lot more room to move on the top thanks to how the cage is designed. There's a lot more of a platform. So while you could do something similar nowadays, you would never be able to fully recreate the move the way that Elix Skipper did it. And so, well, what would be the point? Some things just don't need a redo, especially when it will always be an inferior take. This is Elix Skipper's move, and it will be Elix Skipper's move forever. In pro wrestling, you don't ever fully know how long you've got to really make your mark, and you have to take the opportunity to do so when it comes. Elix Skipper's career wasn't all that long in the grand scheme of things. He wrestled for a little over a decade, continuing to perform well wherever he went, even taking in a reunion of Triple X in 2007 that was explained away by Primetime leaving and then coming back to TNA, thus nullifying the stipulation. His career was sadly curtailed by a horrific personal tragedy. Elix Skipper's eldest son was killed in April of 2009, and he retired shortly after because, well, his heart simply wasn't in pro wrestling anymore. However, on December 5th, 2004, it took Elix Skipper just a few seconds for him to achieve wrestling immortality. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little video, and until the next time, bye for now.